Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for another exciting AdvisorShares AlphaNooner. Today, we are very, very excited to be joined by Matt Johnson, one of the world's leading researchers in the world of psychedelic science and a professor at Johns Hopkins. For more than 2 decades, he's been at the forefront of studying psychedelic medicine and substances and how they can kind of interact with addiction, mental health, and more. So we're going to spend some time kind of talking about where we are in the world of psychedelic medicine, what has been the latest, what he is seeing from a research perspective, and of course, kind of talk about where we are at large. I will say, 1, if you're out there and joining us, really appreciate it as always. 2, if you have any questions, I do think the world of psychedelics has definitely invited a lot of questions. Would love for you to put any of those in the chat, and we can try to get to them as we go along. Just a great resource. Again, I think Matt is very knowledgeable and would love to take advantage of that time to get some of those questions answered, because I think there are still a lot of misconceptions out there, a lot of questions. And so I think that's all it. With all that said, Matt, thanks for joining. Really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Mackenzie.
It's great. It's funny. I know you're basically next door in Baltimore. We're in DC. So I know finally having a nice fall day. So I appreciate you taking the time. I figured just because it's your first time on, and I'm guessing most people probably know your background, your history, but would love to start there just for kind of a table set. Can you tell us just a little bit about yourself, Johns Hopkins, all that stuff? Start.
Yeah, professionally, my PhD is in experimental psychology. Really with a focus broadly in behavioral pharmacology, which is a fancy way of saying studying drugs that affect the mind, drugs that affect behavior, and beyond psychedelics for the last 30 years. I mean, going back to undergraduate days, I've studied basically all of the major drug classes, have published on them. So everything from legal drugs like caffeine and alcohol and nicotine, quite a bit actually with nicotine and tobacco, but cocaine, methamphetamine, opioids, a little bit with cannabis, sedatives, sleeping drugs, really uppers, downers, and all arounders, I like to say. And the psychedelics are sort of all arounders. So I started that work about 21 years ago when I completed my PhD. So they've been a focus, not the only thing. Right now, they're the last few years they've been the exclusive focus pretty much. For most of my career, I've kind of, back when you couldn't really be supported full time as a scientist studying psychedelics, but I had a lot of government grants and whatnot in these other areas. A lot of application of behavioral economics in terms of understanding the nature of addiction and decision making and risk behavior. Of course, all of that sort of very associated with various drugs, particularly addictive drugs. But yeah, psychedelics has been a focus, as I said. I've been involved with therapeutic trials treating depression, some of the earliest therapeutic work in the modern era with treating cancer-related distress, anxiety, and depression, then major depressive disorder outside of cancer. And sort of my baby from the early days in therapeutics has been treatment of tobacco addiction with psilocybin, one of the psychedelics. And the one I've done most work with. But I've had a real focus on safety and risks of psychedelics dating back to my very early days, and kind of trying to help guide folks on how you conduct this work safely and what we know about the risks, how to address them. You've done a lot of survey research as well on, the good and the bad that you get even out in the wild, so to speak. Sort of complementing the stuff and we figured out in the clinical trials. So yeah, that kind of sums it up.
You're spanning a ton. I think it's fair to say. I think you've been in the space for a long time. I think very interesting to spend more time recently, more diving into psychedelics specifically. You mentioned trying to find psilocybin as a treatment for addiction to tobacco, and I think you had that grant set up about 4 years ago, roughly on the dot. We're pretty close to your anniversary there, which is kind of cool.
Still running that. Yep. That's sort of the third study, third clinical trial in the progression of that line of research with psilocybin for tobacco addiction.
I think that's super interesting. And I think something that is I know we talk a lot about psychedelics as it applies more commonly to kind of those other mental health areas like depression, like PTSD, although those things as well. But it does have it seems to be having a space as well in those more day-to-day addictions, which is important and relevant. Out of curiosity, in those 4 years, what has changed? How has that sort of study developed? What have you learned and picked up? What can you kind of share on that front?
Well, I guess in those 4 years, we've had actually, I got that grant before I had partial data from the second trial, which is sort of a comparative study randomizing people to nicotine patch treatment using standard over-the-counter FDA approved label methods versus a single psilocybin session, both with cognitive behavioral therapy as sort of the backdrop, the talk therapy backdrop, not during the psilocybin sessions themselves, but before and after the drug treatment. And that was a very promising trial, which has been completed for a while now. It's yet to be published. It's actually much more difficult to get psychedelic studies published these days. I think it's a bit of a backlash. We've tried to get that into some higher tier journals, but very successful. It looks it over doubled the quit rates of nicotine patch at the 6-month follow up. In terms of so-called point prevalence abstinence, meaning you haven't smoked in the last week, and that's verified biologically through urine and breath samples, was it 52% of the sample from the single psilocybin session group were smoke free, and that compared to 27% with nicotine patch, which is pretty good. Hundreds of studies have been done with nicotine replacement in general, and so that's on the upper side of what you would get at 6 months. And so I think it was a credible control condition, but nonetheless, very, very, very promising results for high success rates in nicotine patch. And so the government funded grant that is currently underway. It's multi-site and it's a blinded study. There's limitations to blinding, and we can get into that if you want to, but it's one of the questions in the field about, in my view, all of these studies designs complement each other. There's no perfect study. There's always trade-offs, pluses and minuses to any particular way of viewing something. And you get the real answer when you sort of use a lot of methods across studies, and if they're all coming to the same answer,
that proves something. I think that's fair. I think, I think the interesting conversation around psychedelics that I think you particularly do a good job of, even if we're, talking about concepts like blinding and all that stuff as well, I do think psychedelics sits in kind of a difficult spot in some ways where I think it can lean too sciencey. Not that blinding is too sciencey, but I think there are a lot of like complex science terms or ways of looking at it that is hard for, I think, the average person, patient, in general to understand. Or I think it can kind of skew on the other side, where I think people are speaking more when they're having psychedelic experiences that are hallucinogenic rather than just the ones that are not, can be kind of hard to connect with from just a conversational element. So I think there is a big need, I would imagine, to have people at this current pace in time who can kind of explain the science in a way that makes sense to people. But finding that line, I think, is difficult. It seems like. Is that something that you come across when you're trying to talk to people?
And I've probably already exemplified this by saying like a blind trial, basically meaning a placebo, and they don't know whether they're on. And so the big criticism, call it functional unblinding, but it basically says, hey, people know if they're tripping or not.
Yeah.
And therefore it kind of defeats the point of the blind, meaning if you're just really stoked about, you're convinced psilocybin is going to be an effective treatment because of all you've read and heard about it. If you know that you've gotten it, all of that expectation might make you get better. So that's the whole functional unblinding controversy. But there's ways to address it, and and again, there's no perfect solution, but that's kind of one of the big scientific I guess limitations. Yeah, it's a puzzle to be figured out, and we got it. Like in science, there's usually no perfect answer, and you never reached a perfect answer to anything, but always just kind of progressing to get a little better and a little closer to ground truth.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It feels very like personality type driven, to be driven to the sciences, to be driven to these types of studies, and I think to psilocybin as well. So again, you do seem well suited to it, which is great. And I think being able to articulate it is important as well. You mentioned, people who are coming in might have expectations around psychedelics and kind of the things that they can do. To me, that kind of ties into the conversation around psychedelics, psychedelic medicine. I think today, generally, I feel like there's a sense that for some people, some people view it almost as like a silver bullet that can do all these crazy things, because we have seen, I think, some really interesting data come out where you are seeing a high level of effectiveness for fewer treatments with fewer side effects, all those important elements. But also it is this sort of hard to pin down medicine versus sort of the more traditional medicine that has been available previously. How do you kind of balance, the optimism and the hope, I think, for psychedelics with, the realities of the world, and trying to not have it be this crazy silver bullet thing that can solve everything all the time kind of thing?
Yeah, there's no silver bullet to addressing
Sure.
this that balance itself, other than, I think, just is, communication. Just do your best, remind people it's not going to work for everyone, you know be aware of sort of the meta science and the science of the science, which tells us that for new clinical treatments, the first studies usually show the biggest effects, and a typical trend, even for ones that turn out to be legitimately effective, so-called effect size, or how well it works, tends to get a little lower. And that's probably for any number of reasons. There's sort of this hype or enthusiasm bubble by early adopters. I mean, the earliest scientists in an era are probably the most enthusiastic. Maybe they're running the trials a little better.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're running the little trials a little worse, in the sense of checking. And some of that
Mm-hmm.
has gone on, including stuff I've been involved with, in terms of designing things kind of to show an effect, rather than really, really like honing down to like what's going to give us the best possible scientific answer.
Mm-hmm.
And we have seen, like in depression, that's where the most clinical trials have been published with psilocybin, and we have seen that sort of decrease in effect size. And so, for example, the phase 2 published Compass Pathways results are not as large as some of the other trials that I've been involved with early on, including the results by the USONA group. And frankly, I think probably the Compass results are the more realistic results. And they even conducted a subsequent trial. I don't think it's published in the scientific literature yet, but by press release, the reports of effect size are, I think they're good. They fall in line with they're totally approvable.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking, somewhat better than standard SSRI treatment, but sort of in line with a variety of things out there, sort of in that range, which you can get with TMS or with Spravato, which is esketamine, the Johnson & Johnson product. So, and I think, depression is something that it's so heterogeneous, and it's going to depend on so many things, how so-called treatment resistant, in other words, how many previous things they've tried, different medications and whatnot. And how much, one of the big areas of discussion is how much psychotherapy. Do you even call it psychotherapy? If you simply prepare someone for the experience, do you even call that psychotherapy? And then this kind of interfaces with, the FDA, which doesn't regulate psychotherapy. So there's sort of an incentive to kind of downplay or not to, and it's not nefarious. It's literally just, of course you're going to do the sort of the minimal to get it to market. And as long as it's effective, then people can combine it with psychotherapy. So, there's all of these nuances, and I think, just letting people know that there are downsides. It's not for everyone. There are risks.
Yeah.
And but it's still incredibly, I mean, it's a different niche that's unlike existing treatments. And anytime you have that, just theoretically, there's rationale for a chance of improvement. So we know very well from the data and from common sense is that if you've tried, 3 SSRIs, the fourth, the chance that that's going to be bad. It's not to say it's not worth trying.
Mm-hmm.
It's, you kind of got the odds stacked against you because these are all variations of the theme. And same thing, you try the 4th SSRI and the 5th SSRI, the more you try, you throw something completely different, which has different mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
There's an improved chance that, hey, here goes something different. And so maybe this will work. And part of the reason I think psychedelics have that potential promise is it's really, whether we call it psychotherapy or not, and whether there's kind of formal branded talk therapy involved, they work through psychotherapeutic process. In other words, even in the survey research and the countless people I've talked to who have just taken a psychedelic at a party, and then they have one of these aha moments and they're like, my God, I drink too much. I need to stop drinking. and I've collected data on all kinds of addiction treatment, from cocaine to tobacco, et cetera, opioids. That's psychotherapeutic process. People say they looked at themselves from a different perspective. They felt had a little more fluidity and be able to make changes in their life. They were more self-reflective. They learned something. They're kind of this change of narrative. And that's all the stuff that you would want from good psychotherapy, or frankly, just development in life as a person. Like, you have certain experiences, it changes your perspective. You travel, you get married, you go through these milestones in life, and you learn something, and you have this increased ability, hopefully, to be more adaptive in meeting the changes you need to make in life. So it's like that. And that's why I think it gives a lot of hope. It gets to the psychological roots of some of these disorders.
Yeah, I think super important. It does seem to give you almost a hyper concentrated version of kind of the things that you're saying, of those life experiences, of those life reflections in kind of a single moment or treatment. But yeah, I think really interesting and definitely needed for people on the mental health side. I know there are tons of stats that I don't have on hand about how many people in the US and abroad are struggling with, a variance of a variety of, I think, like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, PTSD, all these things that I think are complex and do need, I think, maybe a different approach, like you're saying, in terms of treating them. I am curious in terms of viewing it in your work through addiction. Is that easier to kind of work through, just because I think the results sometimes can be easier to pin down? I think with depression, sometimes you are getting a sense, does this person feel better? Do they seem better? But it's kind of harder and murkier to pin down versus they're smoking and now they're not smoking, and it's a much more cut and dry. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And I'm a behavioral psychologist. That's my kind of initial lens. I mean, I'm very eclectic and, like most scientists, in my approach, but that's my initial lens. And so that's frankly the attraction early on to addiction, is that you have a concrete behavior change. And smoking, there's a number of reasons why I went with that early on. One is that even compared to alcohol and some other addictions, it's really easy to biologically verify. In other words, okay, yeah, we get their answer. How much have you smoked in? Are you still smoking? How much have you smoked in the last week, month, et cetera? But again, we're testing their urine. We're having them breathe through like a breathalyzer for smoking, picks up carbon monoxide, a byproduct of smoking. So, it's, I did a lot of work early on with colleagues focused on subjective effects, like mystical experience, spiritual effects. I'm fascinated by that. I've done a lot of work on that. But, there's, as a scientist, you should step back and say, okay, is the person just thinking, or maybe there's a kernel of truth, but they're kind of magnifying it, even unconsciously, are they really changing their life? And so there's nothing better than a biologically verifiable behavioral target that you've been trying to fix for years and sometimes even decades. Been trying to quit smoking since you were in your 20s, and like now you're in your 50s, and we're going to know whether it works or not. You're not whistling Dixie if you pee in the thing and like we tested and there's no nicotine metabolates in your urine.
Yeah, and that tracks it. Out of curiosity, for people who are going through that, do you tend to see, I don't know if you can share it, but do you tend to see people not lying less? Because obviously I think sometimes you're right, they're maybe misgauging how much they're doing it or whatever. After they're having this like psilocybin treatment, do you see it more aligned with what is actually happening for people who are going through that? Or do you see, is it the same thing? People are as bad or as good at estimating their own behavior as they are normally? Just curious.
It's complex. I do get a sense there's some of that sort of kind of greater pragmatism, because they know whether they've been smoking or not. Like I either bought if you smoke 10 cigarettes a day, you buy a pack every 2 days, and it's like, this. And so, you're either smoking or you're not. And also compared to some of my early work, again, on spiritual experience, it's, there's always a range, but I've really liked the smoking population in the sense that, they're kind of more real. It's like the thing that we all have our issues. The thing that they're dealing with is one that's just observable, and it kind of comes with this humility. It's like, man, you could be the great, some great CEO and this very effective person in life, but you're like, like, dude, I've been trying this for years and I'm having trouble. And so there's this humility coming in, and even though there are some people very interested in psychedelics and spiritual experience, you also get plenty of folks that just say, man, this sounds kind of wacky, but I've tried everything except for the kitchen sink. And man, this sounds like the kitchen sink. So why the heck not?
Yeah.
And so I really love those people because they don't really have like a lot invested in the psychedelic. So you get a better cross section of people, including people that aren't particularly interested in psychedelics.
Yeah.
And if it works in them, it tells me something.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, because if they're not already psychologically bought in, yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting. Out of curiosity, so as you're, working through this in terms of how you'd be able to apply it to other addictions, I'd be curious. I feel like there's been a lot of talk about like GLP-1s, very different from psychedelics in a lot of ways, but about that sort of diminishing addictive behavior, I guess, ultimately, or like sort of that desire across a lot of different areas. Are you going to try to move into that with kind of I'm curious what sort of the next
You
move?
mean in terms of different addictive targets?
Yeah.
So yeah, as a field, so I'm personally very interested in like everything in science, it's like for the lack of funding,
Yeah.
but I'm a colleague of my friend Peter Hendrick's trial for cocaine use disorder, which is recently completed, and I shouldn't reveal results other than to say it's very promising. So using psilocybin to treat cocaine addiction, which is frankly probably the hardest nut to crack in terms of addictive disorders. There's no approved medications at all. My colleague Michael Bogenschutz is part of my smoking research, but he's at New York University. He's had a long-standing line of research, kind of similar to mine with tobacco, but he's had alcoholism or alcohol use disorder as the target, and has published a couple of very promising findings. And he's gotten a government grant, and he's moving forward with that. So it's happening. I'm also and I know another colleague of mine, Kevin Murnane, has some funding. I believe he started it to look at methamphetamine use disorder. This is at LSU, Louisiana. I'm very interested in whether it's in the psychiatric Bible, so-called, the DSM or not, like other things I consider addiction. So obesity, food addiction, gambling, sexual. I've been reached out to by people that ask, like, can they use it for whatever, pornography addiction, things like this. I think because of those psychological roots, the way this works, like psychotherapy, I think it's, we've got to test all of it, but I think it's very likely you run it right, it's going to work for these things. I think there's a decent shot that it can work broadly across addictions, which is something I've always interested, even in my other behavioral economic decision-making work on addiction. I've always been interested in the commonalities across addiction, whether it's smoking or opioid addiction. Yes, there's important differences, but I'm interested in those transdiagnostic threads, and this really seems to get that. Again, the self-reflection, the changed personal narratives, the shift in your life priorities. And that's at play with all of these addictive disorders.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It does seem like most of the addiction, and again, I'm not as well versed as you are, is sort of trying to find that brief mini escape from whatever stress, whatever anxiety, whatever thing. So I think being able to lessen that anxiety, maybe coming into it, reduces maybe the need to deal with it or cope with it in some way. And again, I feel like it's one of those things across society that we've needed for a long time, better ways to treat that. But also just kind of with the current setup, I feel like we have, I think Amazon is integrating the gambling app into their streams. I feel like there's a lot of like the slop channel discourse, whatever, in terms of
the
like
online gambling thing is really, I don't know a lot about it, but apparently it's really taken off, and a lot of people are really concerned about that.
I think that's totally fair. I think it is difficult when there are a lot of really good big data that's able to basically not take advantage of human nature in some ways, but I think it is difficult to fight against things like that.
I would say that even if you think it's taking advantage of human nature.
It is, yeah.
I mean, it's that's another argument whether it should be allowed and how it's regulated. But life is risky. I think we should be allowed to do risky, things with reasonable constraints. But yeah, the thing I'm most interested in is something where the person themselves recognizes a problem. I'm not interested, like scientifically or politically, like making people do something they don't want to do. Like if you like smoking and you know the risks and you're good with it, it's like, hey, I drive a car, that's risky. We all make our choices, but like empowering people to make the long-term choices that they're just having their own difficulty getting in line with. That's what excites me. And that's where we need the tools. They need more help and they want help.
Yeah. So ultimately giving somebody more autonomy over themselves and their decisions to be able to get what they want to do. So that makes sense.
Yeah. Enhancing human agency. And Frank, if I had to put my interest in psychedelics into one term, and that's, I think, a big undervalued aspect of what's going on, it's when it works well, you're enhancing agency.
Yeah, that's great. Again, I think that's a great, that ties into what most people, I think, want in their lives. And I think definitely a focus right now, generally. In terms of sort of where we are, you'd mentioned it's an interesting time kind of to be working in this field. Would love to know, not politically focused, but just sort of like what the current environment is for doing this research, because I do think it is important. What is sort of the temp check in terms of where we are? Because I feel like there has been some positive things with some of the administration being more receptive, I think, to more novel treatments. Would love to get a sense of how that kind of ties in for you.
Yeah. I think, in the bigger picture, of course, a lot of people look at the Lycos MDMA rejection about a year ago as a step back. I think there were some very concrete reasons that were actually only a few weeks back. The FDA, due to an FDA policy change, which I think is a good policy change, more transparency. They released the letter. It wasn't available. Like, these are the specific reasons that it was denied. And so I think that's, fortunately, I think a lot of the criticisms are things that, the other sponsors that are moving the compounds forward, they've been doing stuff that shouldn't fall prey to that. They've been, and it also is like providing a reminder, like, okay, this is the pathway forward. So I think it's, it's not the sort of like the death blow that maybe some people maybe thought it might have been. I think it's kind of a growing up and more of a realistic, and there were some things that they should have done better. And I think everyone, learns, and that's been even though it was a disappointment, kind of a wake up call and sort of a gauge to sort of become, get in line with what it's going to take. I think there is a political openness. One of the crazy things I never would have predicted 20 years ago is that psychedelic medicine might be the most bipartisan issue in U.S. politics. There's a lot of conservative and Republican support for it. A lot of that stemming from the very compelling, and I know a number of great folks in this area, veterans, including, I think, in particular, special operators, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, that have tried this to treat PTSD and addictions and depression, and just are kind of turning on their fellow vets to this. And that voice has a lot of sway, and including, I'd say even particularly with those that are more politically conservative. So there's an openness and a source, also sort of the, kind of move, for better, whatever someone thinks of it, the current administration in terms of like FDA and other regulatory agencies saying, hey, like it's more dynamic, we're going to change things up, we're going to not necessarily do the same thing. And also a lot of sort of, re-looking at pharmaceutical industry and how it relates to, the drug approval process. I think a lot of that is, it does, include an opening for something kind of very different, like psychedelics. The research funding in general it's a tougher time in the US. It's difficult to find. I'm actually looking for my next phase of my career now, and I can tell you, it's like the funding is like the big issue. It's kind of, even with the pretty solid background like mine, it's like not easy to find positions in academia now, and to have the funding. So, it's a challenge in general. I don't think that's particular to psychedelics. But yeah, I think, psychedelics aren't going away anytime soon. And I do think there's going to be several approved compounds within the next few years, because sponsors are doing some really good work. I've advised a number of companies. I've turned down far more than I've accepted, but the ones I think are doing ethical, good work, I'm supportive of the field. I want things to get to market if things are being done right. And I think it's a promising area that is going to have a niche in mental health treatment. It's not going to be everything. I always say we want more tools than fewer tools.
Yes.
And so this is going to be a new category of tool that's going to be available, I think.
Yeah, it does seem, just from looking at the data, and again, I don't have the same lens that you do, obviously, in terms of being able to process through the data, but from what I can understand, it does seem like with promising results generally across the board, again, not every company is made the same, not every program is made the same in terms of how things are being studied. I do think it's one of those things that I hope almost can't be turned away from, just because if it is providing better tools for people who do need it, whether that is sort of your everyday person for specific things, or if it is those more extreme things where, like you're saying, veterans, I think, are struggling with PTSD. And I've definitely heard the stories where they're kind of at the end of their rope and, have to go to different countries to try to find treatment because it's sort of their last call to try to find some way to get relief. I think I hope that can't be ignored over time in terms
Right.
of being able to find and develop those treatments. And also, I hope from a funding perspective, maybe we see some government funding of some of that. I would hope and imagine, maybe if it's through the lens of the veteran element, I'm not sure, but hopefully we see that, because I think it's important work.
Yeah.
And
And is VA funding now,
yeah,
and and there's continued NIH funding. I'm biased, but I think there
sure.
could be more.
Yeah,
But
of
there
course.
is that openness and that funding. I mean, that was a major thing in most of my years in this field. It was like the complete lack of government funding. Even when, the FDA and the DEA were approving studies 20 years ago, a lot of people didn't realize I've been saying for years, like, it's the funding arm. It's like the DEA is fine. You get the application together and, like, yeah, it's a little onerous, but, like, you do things right, DEA is going to approve you. FDA will approve you in terms of allowing you to do the study, but it's like the money to do the research was always the hang up. And we've seen big improvements there. We need more, but yeah, we're in a good trajectory.
I think that's great. Is there anything that you think in particular, because I think, again, not to overly compliment you, but I do think you do a good job kind of communicating the needs and the effectiveness and all those things around psychedelics to a lot of different audiences. Is there anything you think that sort of that funding arm, or people kind of in that funding arm, might be missing, need to understand? Because I feel like, or is it just sort of maybe not on their radar really at all, and is sort of going to work its way up as more information comes out, as sort of there's more, not even adoption, but just awareness and research and all of that?
Well, I think that, to me, the biggest thing is to recognize the balance. And frankly, there's been too much in the psychedelic field early on. And hate to say that early on, I fell prey to it. And particularly, as a trainee, and sort of like this idea that the ends justifies the means. Like we're on more of a mission, and including with scientists saying things like this could be important for the survival of the human species and humanity. I think that's a huge mistake. I think that's repeating the mistakes of the 60s. And frankly, we've got to warn folks to listen to those, even amongst so-called credible scientists, really kind of recognize that those are unbalanced positions. Also recognize that there are risks. We've already seen in the field. We're going to see doctors sleeping with their patients. And that's like, we see that in the helping professions way too much as it is. And is it going to be better or worse with powerful psychoactive drugs? So I want to prepare people for the risk benefit balance. You're going to see you're going to see cult-like activity. You're going to see, sexual transgressions. You're going to, I want to get us to the point where, like, the answers to this are unbalanced. Like, what can we do to improve training? What can we do to have, like, that, the regulatory bodies providing appropriate sanctions, identifying these things, putting a stop to it when it happens. But it's sort of like, because this happens in, psychotherapy, we're not banning psychotherapy. We're doing our because, on the other side of that is equations. Look at all the people that have been helped by the large majority of people who are helped. So it's like any other thing like this, like the sexual abuse scandal within the Roman Catholic Church. It's like, we're not like, the large majority of priests are, I would say, serving their communities and their parish or what have you, and are not doing anything like that. So it's like, what can we do to find a balance? And I want to prepare people to say, if you see some of these extreme things, recognize that can come with this territory. These are very, very powerful tools. And if we don't do a good job we're going to see more of that. If we do a good job, those things aren't going to be zero. But if we do a good job, we can keep them to a minimum.
Mm-hmm.
And if we do a good job, the benefit that it has for people is going to outweigh those areas of harm. So it's like any new technology, it's going to depend on how we wield it, how responsible we are. And frankly, I think getting away from some of the overblown expectations. I mean, I've talked to, thousands of people in research, outside of research.
Sure.
I've never met an enlightened person, but the whole range of like ethics, it's like you get the whole distribution of humanity, including amongst those of you psychedelics, including amongst psychedelic therapists. But the area does attract some extreme types. And this was researchers in the 60s were saying this. And so we've got to be aware of that and just do everything we can to kind of have that balance and hopefully prepare if there's a front page story about one of these horrible things happening, having a balanced view of how we deal with it rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
I was trying to figure out which idiom to use basically to capture exactly what you're saying. Yes, no, I think that's true. I think unfortunately, human nature and bad actors will touch every area of any space. And I think it is the responsibility to try to prevent that harm and try to, I guess, remove bad actors as you go along. I think that is probably some of the view that you were talking about of not treating it as the end all be all, the silver bullet, this amazing thing. I think it has a lot of benefit, but again, not this separate from the world kind of thing. Ultimately, I guess is the way to do it. Interesting perspective though. I had not thought about that. I think ultimately. All right. Well, then I think in terms of just where we are, it seems like we are moving along in the world of psychedelics. Where do you feel like we're still early, kind of in the middle? What's your sort of general sense? And would love to hear kind of, in the next 2 to 3 years, where you kind of think things might end up or go, or where you'd like to
I
go?
think we're still ground floor. I mean, and I remind people like, hey, the initial approval, like one of these days, there's no guarantee, but very likely that, MDMA is going to be approved for PTSD and psilocybin is going to be approved for depression, et cetera. LSD for generalized anxiety disorder. My bet is that these things are going to happen. That's just the beginning. I mean, I also remind people clinically, we're essentially using the same approach as was first published in 1959 by a research group in Saskatchewan in terms of how you do this therapy. We use terms like integration, which is kind of discussing with the person afterwards, and depending on the study, a week later, or a few weeks later, works pretty darn good. But don't tell me that we're maximizing like efficacy. And if we combine it with the very promising animal research on so-called neuroplasticity, these different forms where the brain appears to be more malleable, which by the way is consistent with both therapeutics and abuses, and with brainwashing and Charles Manson's cult, he used LSD to brainwash people. But that malleability, what can that's probably happening in people. You kind of got to cut open brains to really, which is why it's we know it from the animal research,
Sure,
but that's very, very likely a part of the formula, along with this powerful, experience, the overt psychedelic experience that is something to be learned from. But if this is in part increased propensity for learning, a malleability in the mind, we need a whole science on what do you do? Like what homework can we give people? What can we, right now we're really not, there's not a single experimental randomized study that has looked at anything other than drug versus placebo or drug versus, or, different doses of the same drug. It's like, does it work better with cognitive behavioral therapy, or maybe just a so-called supportive care model versus acceptance and commitment therapy, on and on and on, prolonged exposure or cognitive processing for PTSD. To me, that's where most of the action is going to happen. Like, how can we optimize these treatments? And then moving outside of therapeutics, if this is really learning enhancement and plasticity, what about learning new languages? What about any number of goals? What about adopting a new career as AI takes over and all of a sudden your professional job is gone and you've got to jump into a new field when you're 51 years old like me? Like, can it help you jumpstart the learning of new skills. I mean, to me, those are also part of this kind of landscape of the future. How can we leverage these compounds like most effectively? And so most of that work, I mean, we need to develop new psychedelics, and that's kind of where, and it's understandably that intellectual property, you're on the most solid ground. You have a new compound that didn't exist in the universe before. But to me, scientifically, the most interesting stuff is how, like, these models of understanding how we're conducting this therapy, how we can optimize it and move it into new, areas of new targets, both kind of therapeutic and, call it human flourishing, but not in sort of it's going to save the world and age of Aquarius, everyone's enlightened, but no, in very pragmatic ways. If you want to increase pro-social behavior, how about you have your session, you have someone volunteer at hospice for the next like several weeks. Like maybe that's going to have more of a measurable increase in people learning to move their life in a more pro-social area than just the idea of like the more people take psychedelics, like the better human beings we're going to be. So that's the stuff that kind of really excites me. And I think that just the approval of the initial therapeutic indications is like, we're not even at the beginning yet. And so for scientists that want to jump into it, like it's still ground floor.
Wide open, jump in.
Yeah.
That is amazing. One, especially just because I think you did read my mind. I've actually talked with a lot of people in the office about the language learning element. Like I know obviously first you do want to be treating the things that people need the most, mental health, for a lot of the time, addiction, those things can be really important. But I am really interested as well as somebody who appreciates, loves languages, does not really super have a mind or tongue for languages. I do think things like that would be fantastic. And I think the parallels with AI in some ways are interesting. I think it is something that is promising, but you need to, it is ultimately a tool. It's how you use it, how you respond with it, and knowing its limitations, risks, all those things give you a more holistic view of what it is. And I think you can treat it more appropriately when you have that information. So I think fantastic, very interesting. Would love to know, of course, like how can people support, get involved, follow? If any government agencies out there are looking to kick up some funding, go ahead if you're out there. But what would you point people to?
So you can follow what I'm doing. Probably the main thing is on X, or formerly Twitter. Has it been long enough we could drop saying, formerly known as the artist, formerly known as Prince, but drug_researcher. And, they can, folks can, reach out to me through that, or I'm not hard to find by email, mattjohnson98@gmail.com. But, if someone happens to, have connections to funding and is interested in some of this work, reach out to me, and, we can find a way. And again, I'm kind of looking at the next phase of my career in terms of where I'm going to land and the work I'm going to do. So I'm definitely all ears for anyone who wants to support some innovative work in this field, including the enhancement of human agency, which is kind of at the top of my list, ways to study that in terms of the brain and psychology. So yeah, that's a little bit of a pitch there, but
no, that's fantastic. I love it. I think that's great. And yeah, I think a lot of, I can't imagine people wouldn't want to develop in those areas. So I feel like I think we've talked about like not technofuturism, but using technology to enhance humans in terms of what they do. So I think using drugs or substances to be able to do a similar thing is also squarely where we are and like where a lot of the focus is. But yeah, I think in general, one, really appreciate all the work that you're doing, both from like a testing side, but also genuinely from a communication side. I do think this sort of theme and time for studying these types of psychedelics and what they can do across a broad range is really important. And I think being able to have somebody who's been in it for a long time now, and I think can articulate well kind of what is going on in it is really important in this current moment. So appreciate it. But I would definitely also send, everyone, give him a follow, stay in tune with what he's up to. And of course, obviously, if there's a way to engage, I would definitely recommend as well. With all that said, Matt, thanks for joining. Thanks for taking the time. Appreciate it. And
thanks for having me, Mackenzie. Appreciated the conversation. It's been enjoyable.
Really appreciate it. All right. Thank you so much. We'll catch you next time. Thanks everyone for joining.
Before investing, carefully consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses found in the prospectus, available at AdvisorShares.com.
you.